Given recent events, this is the video that I was really having a hard time making. Whenever there's a high-profile incident, everybody comes out to pick a side, and usually it's pretty clear which side is right and which side is wrong. It's very hard to make a video and not to pick a definitive side when it comes to what a specific situation was. I'm going to try and avoid doing that as much as possible, and instead I'm going to present things as they are. Any use of force can never be justified by fear. It can only be justified by facts. And I'm hoping in this video, I'll be able to present the facts to you when it comes to making a decision as to whether lethal force was appropriate in a given situation. Once you have that information and that knowledge, it's then up to you to apply it to whatever you're looking at, whether it's video footage, whether it's a write-up of what took place, whatever it happens to be, and how you digest news. That way, you're not just having an opinion that comes from tribalism, that comes from anger, that comes from fear, that comes from rhetoric, or comes from whatever narrative you're being fed from the top down to explain away an action that may or may not have been appropriate in the circumstances. You are the one that, if you are in that situation, will make the judgment. But you're also the one that's going to be judged by other people on the criteria of whether that use of force was permitted or not. That is what I'm hoping to cover in this video. It's going to be a different tone than the reality checks I normally do, but I make no apologies for that, because this subject is one that's long overdue being discussed, and I'm hoping this will bring some balance and some temperance to a situation which is already a powder keg, and to be honest with you, may explode any day now. Welcome to Reality Check. Across common law, civil law, UN standards, and policing doctrine, any lawful use of force, especially when it comes to the use of lethal force, has to meet three criteria. The wording in various jurisdictions varies, but it boils down to the same thing: the means, the intent, and the capability. Sometimes this is called the weapon, the intent, and the delivery system. Some jurisdictions, Canada being one of them, sometimes goes further still, and they will say target identification, target isolation as well. This gets a little bit redundant, and it certainly goes a little bit more in depth than the universal standard. But be that as it may, with those three in place, that's when you have, or at least the potential to have, the ability to justify a lethal force deployment. If you do not have all of those present, whilst there may still be a threat, it does get very, very difficult to articulate lethal force in a given situation. And consequently, the force and the response employed must be reduced and must be lowered down. Any actions that were taken must be reflective of those three criteria. If we look at the US, under the US Supreme Court precedents and decisions, deadly force being used when an officer reasonably believes that a suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious physical injury, based on an objective assessment of what the suspect can, intend, and is able to do. This standard stems from Tennessee versus Garner, and it was generalized in Graham versus Connor, which is under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonable test. If we even take that aside, which is very specific to the US, we have three things that we have to justify. Can they hurt? Are they intending to hurt? And are they capable of hurting? If we tick all three of those boxes, then we do potentially have a lethal force situation, or certainly one where that becomes a primary tactical consideration. This does speak to use of force as employed by police services, but it's also something that needs to be borne in mind from a civilian perspective if we're going to be using lethal force in defense of ourselves or defense of others. It's also important to recognize that lethal force is not something that you can use in defense of property. If someone's stealing something, the use of lethal force to prevent that theft is getting pretty sketchy. But that's something we'll explore in depth a little bit later on. But right now, let's look at each of those individual pieces and get a little bit further into the details. The first of the three pillars that we're actually going to deal with is the means of delivering damage, often referred to as the weapon. Is this person or persons capable of inflicting death or serious harm upon myself or upon another party? A weapon can literally be anything: firearm, knives, swords, cudgels, anything that generally we recognize as a weapon. But it also includes esoteric objects. It can be an environmental thing like a wall. If you're trying to smash someone's head into a wall, the wall itself can become a weapon simply because you're using it as a way to do lethal force or potentially grievous bodily harm to the person. It can be something like size and physical skill. It can even be volume of numbers. If you've got 5 people that are going to be inflicting physical harm upon you, individually, one punch might be hard to justify lethal force. 5 people punching you over and over and over again, it gets a little bit harder to actually explain why you didn't use lethal force against all those people. One thing that's important to recognize is a weapon is not just what is in the hand. It is anything which can be used to produce a lethal effect or a seriously injurious effect on a person. Capability alone, though, is not enough. The mere presence of a weapon is not sufficient to justify lethal force against that person, and that's very, very important to recognize. People carry objects every day which can be considered weapons. Knives are a very, very common one. Firearms, depending on the jurisdiction, can also be something that's carried on a day-to-day basis, specifically if it's your job, of course. You'll also find walking sticks. You'll find big, hefty things that could be used as cudgels. Anything like that can and is considered a weapon if it's employed as such. So the simple presence of something alone is not the be-all and end-all when it comes to deciding whether lethal force can be used. But it is the first of the columns that we've now ticked off. The second of the columns that we're dealing with is the intention column. Does this person mean to cause me bodily harm or death? Is they demonstrating the will and the capability against me or against others? This can be shown through verbal threats, target fixation, that's staring and obsession that you get, aggressive movements, prior behavior in the immediacy to engaging with me at that moment in time, a refusal to disengage, an escalation in patterns, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes context and history. This becomes important when we're thinking about gang members, convicted cop killers, and that sort of thing too. And it's normally something you find specifically in reports. However, in domestic scenarios and situations, you'll often find relationships will then be escalating in violence used within that. You can find exes, you find stalkers, and you find this sort of history day to day everywhere that we actually look in the newspapers and we're reading about reports and crimes. Intent is about behaviors, though, not attitudes. Someone can be angry, still doesn't justify lethal force. Someone can be silent and absolutely lethal. So the mere volume and agitation and anything else that's being deployed, whilst it can show their emotional state, it is not enough to reach that threshold. We judge by the intention of what they are doing, not what we assume, not what we feel, and not how we think they are feeling. This is another very important thing that we have to factor into it. Intention doesn't mean the offence. That is a completely separate matter. The offence itself is irrelevant to the intentions of the individual when it comes to using lethal force. Of course, if their intention is murder and homicide, that's of course self-evident within the offence itself. But even something as extreme as, say, a bank robbery doesn't automatically mean that the intentions of that person is to commit lethal force upon myself or another. It's a good indication that they might, and usually if it's an armed bank robbery, they're going to have the weapon present too. But it does not de facto mean lethal force is going to be there. Everything is that objective analysis of the situation as it stands. So now we have our weapon, we have our intention covered. Let's move on to the third and probably the most misunderstood piece. The third piece is the delivery system, probably the most misunderstood of all of them. The way I used to explain this was, imagine a bullet. On its own, it can't do much. It needs the gun to fire it. The gun is the delivery system. If we look at the bullet as being the weapon and the intention being me wanting to shoot you, I need the gun to be able to get that bullet to you. It is an oversimplification, and I'm not suggesting that the presence of a gun should be assumed there's no bullet in it. But you get the analogy and where I'm coming from with that. Basically, the delivery system is the ability of an individual to deliver the force that they're intending to use and the weapon that they're manifesting that force with. There are several factors that can influence whether they actually have a suitable delivery system. Distance and positioning is one. Their ability to access the weapon is another. The speed and mobility of the individual, the distance away from you, any terrain, any obstacles, and indeed the position of the person that they're issuing the threat to. A knife at 30 meters is very, very different than a knife at 3 meters. Similarly, a gun that's tucked in the waistband or perhaps at the rear of an individual's trousers is very different than a gun that's in the hand. Capability plus intention without a delivery system equals potential. Capability plus intention plus a delivery system equals an immediate threat and should be dealt with accordingly. Once we get these three things in place, means, intent, and delivery system, we are at a situation where we have a justifiable lethal threat situation. Remove one item from that equation and the justification weakens significantly. If you have the means only, that's a pretty low threat, to be honest. If you have the means and the intention, we have an elevated threat. When all three are present, obviously we're now looking at lethal force deployment, or certainly the capability and the capacity to do so. This is what courts, investigators, review boards, and everyone else involved in the legal system will look for, even if they use different language to explain that. It's also what we should be looking for when we're judging situations and scenarios on video evidence and what we can see with our own eyes. Sometimes lethal force in and of itself is very, very shocking, very startling to the system. There was a video that came out not too long ago where an individual was shooting actively at the police officers and he was ran down with the car. Now, this situation, when you actually look at it in isolation, is like, oh my goodness, you ran him over. But that's an appropriate use of force to someone that's firing guns at police officers and indeed bystanders around and not caring about who gets hit. And it ended the situation. Are there other ways that it could have been dealt with other than running him over? Sure, he could have been shot too. But he wasn't listening to reason. He wasn't giving up. So I would argue in those circumstances, that's when you have a lethal force response that's appropriate. In other situations that we see lethal force in, though, we might not necessarily have that. Once you've got all three, now you're in the business of actually saying this is now a tactical consideration that really needs to be employed. However, if you do not have all three criteria, then you're going to have a very hard time explaining if lethal force not only could be used, but should be used. What is very important to remember, though, is this is a dynamic assessment. The window for lethal force is very, very narrow, both in terms of if you don't use that lethal force, the force can be coming on you, but it can also be something which vanishes in an instant. You can have all three criteria present and then one of them can vanish in the next moment. They shift constantly. Distance changes. Intentions can escalate or de-escalate. Weapons can appear or disappear. They can be dropped. Barriers can come and go. You are not judging a snapshot in time. You're judging a moving picture. This is why training is absolutely essential. In an ever-evolving situation, you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And just because you hit that threshold of lethal force once, doesn't mean you get to stay there. If there are other options you can take, and there are other situations that evolve as a result of it, you don't just pursue the course of conduct that you reached at the highest level. Does it still remain on the table as a viable tactical option should circumstances change again? Absolutely. That's why it's called a dynamically changing situation. If you're not physically capable, emotionally capable, or mentally capable, though, of stepping back from the lethal force threshold, you're going to have to ask some serious questions of both your training and indeed your own psychological makeup. I appreciate, having been there myself, that these split-second decisions are never easy ones to make. But that's why you train. And if the training isn't provided for you, you have to provide it yourself. If you're unwilling or unable to do that, you have to be asking some serious questions about the role that you're actually filling. After any serious use of force event, three questions are going to be asked. What did you see? What did you believe? And was that belief reasonable in the circumstances? The weapon, intent, and delivery system framework gives a structured answer. They had a gun, they were advancing rapidly, they ignored commands and were within striking distance. That works. They had a gun on them and they were struggling a little bit when I was trying to get hold of them. I would argue that doesn't. Because although they're resisting the arrest, and although they have a weapon on them, they don't have an intention displayed there, nor do they have a delivery system. So if you're now not ticking the boxes, I don't care what you think can happen. I don't care what the potential that might happen in a different situation. You're not in that situation. You're now responding from fear and from feelings, not from facts. As we discussed at the beginning, and as we've shown throughout all these, you can't act on that. Fear does not dictate force. Facts do. Violence cannot be emotional. It's mechanical. Threat is not about fear. It's about function. Can they hurt me? Do they want to hurt me? And can they do it now? That is the entire equation that we have to use to judge the actions of myself when I'm actually doing something, or the actions of others when we're looking at what they've taken and what they've done. That's what, when the videos are out there, you're looking at them, you should be objectively assessing them on. Take away the fact that someone lost their life. Take away the fact that you think the person that lost their life was doing something that shouldn't have been done. Both of these are emotional. And look at it in the hard light of weapon, intent, delivery system. Were all three things present? And intention is something that you have to drive to. It can't be something that is, well, they might have had it. It has to be something you can clearly articulate. There are another couple of pieces that I really want to address at this juncture as well before we close out. People will often point to someone, what they did, an offence, a crime, aggressive behaviour, all those sort of things, and assume that that alone justifies the lethal force. Comment sections will often be very, very full of such suggestions. This isn't the case. Doing something wrong, even something serious, does not automatically make someone a lethal threat. It simply does not. Force is not justified by past actions. It isn't justified by anything that they've done in their past, said in their past, or even what they're doing at a given moment in time outside of those three main criteria. Force is justified by present conditions and present conditions alone. What matters is not what they did, but what they're doing right now. There's another uncomfortable truth that we have to talk about as well. If you deliberately create conditions that make violence more likely by escalating it unnecessarily, by crowding someone, humiliating them, provoking them, or removing reasonable options for them, then claiming lethal force becomes very, very difficult to justify. You don't get to manufacture danger and then cite it as the reason as to why you use lethal force. And there are several court decisions, one as late as 2025, that actually explain that in great detail. If you put yourself in danger unnecessarily, then you can't use that to then explain why you use lethal force to get yourself out of the danger in the first place. Similarly, if there are options whereby you can remove yourself from that danger, you remove the delivery system. The triangle no longer exists. And again, you can't go to the higher option. It doesn't make sense, either from an ethical perspective, a moral perspective, and certainly not a legal perspective. In professional standards worldwide, this is called officer-created jeopardy or self-generated risk. In plain language, if your choices made things worse and not safer, you own that. Force is supposed to be a last resort, not a shortcut, not a punishment, and not a way out of a really bad decision. When I created Reality Check, I wanted it to always be about responsibility before you actually react. You are responsible for your positioning, your tone, your timing, and your restraint. Because once you push a situation past a certain point, nobody's going to win that. Deadly force is not about winning. It's about stopping an immediate and unlawful threat. When weapon intent delivery systems align, time collapses, options vanish, and responsibility lands on you. Your job is to recognize that moment, and only that moment. Thanks for watching, and I hope that this video has given you some insights and some understanding of lethal force and the criteria that need to be met before lethal force can be justified. If you have weapon intent and delivery system present, then lethal force is a tactical consideration. If, however, you do not, lethal force is not, and using lethal force in that situation is not only highly questionable, you're probably looking at a situation where the person doing so should be facing some very, very serious charges. I haven't commented on specific cases, but now if you've watched this video through, you do have a framework whereby you can analyze the cases that are out there and you can make a decision, and more importantly, an educated and informed decision on whether that use of force was justified or not. This was a little more in-depth than I normally go into on these reality check courses, but I think it's very, very important that we do so. The podcasts themselves are normally informative and edutainment. This isn't particularly entertaining, but I'm hoping the information contained herein is something that's allowed to bring a little bit of balance back to the proceedings. Don't react with emotion. React with what is. See what is, and deal with facts, not fear. That goes for both sides. Let's be better, guys. The world's dark enough as it is. We need to start lighting our candles and make it a little bit brighter each day.
Yo.
He's crossing distance.
Step into the scene, it's about to get real. Lessons from the streets, no Hollywood real. Jay Cooper in the house, better show respect. When danger comes close, it's a reality check. 35 years.